I want to spend 2 minutes on the Eagles-Niners, okay? And here's the thing, and because this will help the argument or the discussion about the Chiefs-Bengals officiating debacle. Right? Because the officiating wasn't just bad because of the last call, which I vehemently disagree with. It was an atrociously officiated game and managed game by the officials, right? Like, your job as officials are so that we don't actually know you exist. That's when you're really good. Doesn't mean you don't throw penalties, but it's not like, man, what the hell? They're stopping the game and giving them an extra play, and holy cow, what the hell's going on here? But two things can be true at once. Like, the Eagles are a loaded team, and they're really good. And I can be completely and utterly unimpressed with them offensively at the same time. Right. They've played the easiest schedule in the NFL. They had a walk to a Super Bowl. The game was close, and their offense did nothing until Josh Johnson comes in and he fumbles twice. Like, it was a 7-7 game. He fumbles twice. He's their fourth string quarterback. There's a reason he's played for 14 teams. My guess would be, no matter how loaded your roster is, nobody wins with a fourth string quarterback in the NFC or AFC championship game. I mean, what a debacle. And like, we're all celebrating Jalen Hurts. Like, when the game was a real game, he was not good. You know, they scored 2 Miles Sanders touchdowns when they picked up fumbles. That's it. And then they just did enough to hold him off and score some points. Because, I mean, like, the Niners literally could not throw a football. You had a quarterback who could not throw a football. That was one of the most bizarre games ever. Right? Where your fourth-string quarterback gets hurt, so your third-string quarterback who can't throw comes back in. They don't have him throwing, so they have your star running back throw the football. I can't think of a more, I don't even know how to describe that game, Dan Byer. Like, have you ever seen anything, a game of that importance? Because when the last time I saw an injury like that happen, remember it was Colt McCoy when he had the nerve, like a pinched nerve in the national championship game against Alabama. And, you know, so it wasn't it just took a while to heal, but he couldn't pick up a football. So they threw in Garrett Gilbert, who, I mean, he was a very highly touted recruit, and he wasn't terrible. He just wasn't Colt McCoy. But, like, dude, we're talking fourth string quarterback who then gets hurt, and now you don't have any other quarterbacks on your roster. Your emergency quarterback is your fullback.
Well, that's a whole other story, but that there's a lot to it. But I've never seen that situation in a game like that. And in fact, I compare it to fantasy football, and the reason I say that, Doug,
I know. I think I know where you're going, but go.
In our league, we made sure that guys would be able to field the rosters, like in the playoffs. Like, you don't want everybody, you know, picking up 8 guys for the championship game. It's not a real depiction of you know, how the season has gone. So a lot of leagues put in rules on, can you pick up a guy after this point? Can you pick up? But we made rules in our fantasy league to make sure that someone would at least have a starting quarterback to play in a game. So like we made adjustments for that because we just thought it was fair, and that's how you would want to settle a game of that magnitude. And for that game to come down to that, never seen it before. Nothing remotely close.
All right, let's get to the officiating in the Bengals-Chiefs game. And I think, and Dan, you and I have talked about this a little bit, but again, you never know who's listening. I am not a Steelers fan. I am not a Seahawks fan. Okay? And one of the things that you will find about me, okay, and you guys I think know this, but people who read on Twitter who don't know, like, my entire sports life, like, I just wanted like a fair game, right? Just as fair as possible. And they're going to blow calls. They're going to be a charge block is hard. Pass interference can be difficult, right? Holding can be really hard. I get it. You're going to miss calls. Even spotting a football, like, really we're going to go by some 70-year-old dude's eyes on where the ball was stopped when there's a scrum and you can't really tell. All that stuff is difficult. There was the play last night where, I forget the wide receiver from the Chiefs, but he reached out the ball, but then he brought it back. Well, if you voluntarily bring it back, that's your own forward momentum. I was confused because I don't believe by letter of the rule they followed it correctly. But I bring up Steelers and Seahawks because that was the worst officiated Super Bowl I can remember. It was so bad, and it felt one-sided against the Seahawks. And I would like to think that, I don't think last night they had it in for the Bengals, but God, it sure felt that way. Right? I don't think, but there's some like league conspiracy. But man, that was a terribly officiated game on a multitude of levels. Let's start with the Super Bowl. And Dan, I know you're a Seahawks fan, but for people who have forgotten, and you don't forget anything, that's as bad of officiating Super Bowl as I've ever remembered.
Yes. And there were parallels to last night because it felt like it was building up or, all right, here comes another call. Oh, wait, you thought that was bad. How about this? Like it was almost then each thing was topped throughout the game. That was the feeling.
So my belief, and we'll get into it deeper on the podcast, a little bit more verbose, maybe the language will change a little bit. It's called In the Bonus. That's the third hour podcast. My belief is this. There's something called a bar in officiating, okay, where you got to get over that bar to call it. It's like with holding. Like you call holding on any play when it gets egregious and outside your shoulder pads, and it stops the guy from making a tackle. Like, all right, I got to call holding. It's like pass interference. There's contact on seemingly every play when the ball is in the air. And what's the bar there? Is that one, is the ball catchable? And two, like there's lots of different things to it. And the more important the moment, the more that bar raises, and you want to be sure. And really good officiating is like, hey man, I could have called that, but I'm going to hold on to it because it didn't really affect the play, and this is way too big a game. That last call was crap. It was crap. Did Joseph Ossai, did he make contact with Pat Mahomes and push Pat Mahomes, who had already stepped out of bounds? Yes. Yes. Well, you're like, well, then by letter of the law. Yes. Question. Okay, but by letter of the law, Joe Burrow throws the football and gets popped like 3 strides later by a linebacker for the Chiefs. Wasn't called. And I didn't think it should be called. Why? In a game of that magnitude, like you don't call that. There's a couple other late hits. Joe Mixon down around the goal line. He's in the green, past the white. You don't call that. Like you don't call these things. But they did. They absolutely did. And in that particular call, that one especially, like, dude, time, score, you're the official, like, it wasn't a late hit. If Joe Ossai had launched his body into Pat Mahomes and hit him, by all means. If Joe Ossai had even dove at his legs, hit Pat Mahomes in the knees, by all means. A one-hand push, which, let's just be honest, Mahomes sold it. He flopped. That won the Chiefs the game. They weren't in field goal range. It's a spot foul. It had no effect on the play. It had no effect on Mahomes whether or not he's injured or not. And don't give me he's got a bad ankle. Wait, okay, so you're taking into context he has a bad ankle, but we can't take into context there's like 8 seconds left to go in the game? It's crap. And you can't even give me what Gene Sarator says. Because if Gene's mic was off, he would say, you don't call that there. If you remember back, okay, you remember back to when the Saints should have had pass interference called against them by the Rams, right? The Rams cornerback hit, I forget who it was from the Saints early. Like, remember, that play was so egregious that they actually changed, you could review pass interference the next season just because of that call. But if you remember the audio of what Sean Payton said was, that's a Super Bowl call. And you're like, what do you mean it was a Super Bowl call? There was no penalty thrown. Exactly. In the Super Bowl, they try and throw as few penalties as possible. Do you know why? Because of the heightened importance of the game. Because they know if there's 150 million people watching, 80 to 90 have no idea about football. And the last thing we want is to muck up the fact that Rihanna is performing at halftime because we threw some penalty that nobody really understands, or 90 million people don't understand what a penalty is or why it was thrown. The heightened level of importance of the game brings up a heightened bar into what you call. The Seahawks knew this. If you remember, when they faced the Broncos and they demolished the Broncos. Go back and look. The Seahawks defensive backfield, they held on every play. Held on every play. It's the same reason that the Patriots would beat the Colts in the playoffs except for 1 year, because they were basically, it was pass interference up to the point where they would call it. You can't call them all, and they call far fewer in the playoffs. Everybody knows that. And that call last night was, and I know many of you feel like, hey, listen, they call that in the regular season, they call that. I get it. Taking time, score, contact, he's like a foot out of bounds. The guy pushes him, he doesn't hit him. What are we doing ending a game on such a crummy call? Here's Joe Ossai, the linebacker for the Bengals, who committed the penalty after the game.
I got to learn from experience, and I got to know not to get close to that quarterback when he's close to that sideline. If there's anything that could possibly cause a penalty in a dire situation like that, I got to do better. I was just in full chase mode, and I was trying to push him to maybe get him going backwards, because I knew he was going for that sideline. I was trying to make him go backwards, get that clock running, but I didn't know. I haven't seen it yet. I didn't know how far out of bounds we were.
Vito, by the way, sent me a text. How many times has Pat Mahomes faked being out of bounds just to get a couple more yards, stick that ball out? He's right. It wasn't egregious. So I think it was a horrific call, considering time and score. You're like, wait a second, he stepped out. I'm not saying by letter of the law, you're not right. There's the spirit of the law. If we go by letter of the law, every one of us who drives home on a freeway is getting pulled over, because every one of us go over 65 miles an hour. Right? And many of us, you drive 80 in a 65, you're like, I'm keeping up with the flow of traffic. So context matters in sports, in life, with penalties, with everything. The context absolutely matters. And my guess would be that most people who view the Super Bowl as beyond reproach in terms of how we do officiating, again, Seahawks, Steelers notwithstanding, they don't call penalties. Why are we not approaching at least end of AFC Championship game the same? By I respect your opinion, what do you think of the last call?
I don't want to be a sit on the fence guy, but if I can just take 30 seconds to explain. Yeah. I think this penalty falls between two things. I think it falls between the LeBron foul that we saw on Saturday night that wasn't called on one end, and then it falls between, if you remember at the end of the TCU-Michigan game where there was a targeting review on the fourth down.
Yes, and they didn't call it.
And the Michigan player was not going to get the first down. The game was going to be over. And I think it falls in between that. And the reason that I say that is I do think that it was obviously a penalty, as you're saying, but to the point of the LeBron was he's not going to miss that layup. The foul by Tatum affected the outcome of the game. LeBron does not miss that shot. And at least put him on the free throw line to have the two shots. In the TCU game, the outcome was over. Targeting was put in as a rule to protect players so they aren't seriously injured. And so I didn't feel like it should be called. And I felt that that's where that penalty was toggling between those two calls. I guess in the end, I think they made the right call. But, I know it sounds like I'm wishy-washy on it. If I ultimately had to decide, I think they made the right call. But okay. I can be swayed.
No, but here let me back up the LeBron thing. Okay, what I thought was really good in the officiating. Okay, they missed the call. There's just no other way to he has a layup, he gets hit in the wrist, he's going to lay it in, it's a foul. Okay, they blew it. LeBron threw one of the all-time fits. Did they tee him?
No.
You know why? Not because LeBron, but because I think I missed it, guys. Because you can't go what'd you guys see? You missed it. You get hit in the wrist. So what you do is you give a guy all right, I'm going to give you a little space to throw a little fit, knowing I missed the call. I'm not going to compound it. And then, they get in the huddle, and then Patrick Beverly grabs the camera and shows him on the camera and showed the lead ref, not actually the ref that missed the call. And okay, now I got to call a T. The point is that the time, the score, the situation, all of that stuff does matter. It just does, especially with a dead ball penalty. And I'm not on the fence. I don't think it was close. It's not that I don't respect your opinion. I know Ramos' opinion is completely the opposite. I'm just telling you, there's no way if I'm officiating that game that it has to be so egregious that a penalty flag has to be thrown. And it didn't get to that. It did not rise to that level, in my opinion. And I believe most of us would say that. And again, this is me admitting full well he did make contact when Pat Mahomes was out of bounds. But again, I would easily bring up that Joe Burrow threw a football a couple drives previously, and he got popped in the chest and sold it and fell back. Popped in the chest, but it was a good 3 strides after the ball was released. That's called a penalty every time in the regular season. And they made the right decision to not call it. But you can't say, hey, it didn't really affect the play. Doesn't rise to that level. Too important a game. And then guy steps out of bounds, gets pushed, takes a dive, and you don't do the same thing. That's bad officiating.